The morning sun hadn't fully climbed over the Atlanta skyline when Captain Darian Okoro stepped out of his car at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. He wore his navy blue uniform with crisp white shirt and gold braid on the shoulders. 4 stripes, the mark of a captain. His flight bag hung comfortably over one shoulder, and his walk carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent half his life in the sky. At 39, Darian had flown everything from regional turboprops to wide-body jets across 3 continents. He wasn't flashy about it. He didn't need to be. The sky knew his name, and so did the airline. Inside the crew lounge, the usual pre-flight hum filled the air, coffee machines gurgling, pilots comparing weather reports, flight attendants checking their kits. Darian nodded to a few familiar faces but kept to himself. He liked these quiet moments before the storm of boarding announcements and cabin checks. Today's flight was routine. Skyward Airways Flight 217 nonstop to Denver. Nothing fancy, nothing urgent. Just another day moving people from one place to another, safely and on time. He reviewed his paperwork, double-checked the fuel load, and skimmed the passenger manifest. All normal. Then he headed toward the gate, ID clipped to his chest, cap snug on his head. As he walked through the jet bridge and into the cabin of the Airbus A320, he felt the familiar shift, the transition from ground to air, from ordinary to purpose, but not everyone saw it that way. Near the front galley, Livia Marsh stood arranging drink carts with practiced efficiency. She'd been with Skyward Airways for 8 years, and in that time she'd built a reputation, not just for her polished service, but for her sharp eye. "I can spot a fake from a mile away," she often told new hires during training. She prided herself on vigilance, on protecting the aircraft from anything that felt off. That morning, something about the man walking toward the cockpit made her pause. He was tall, yes, and moved with authority, but he looked younger than she expected a captain to look. His skin was deep brown, his features calm, his steps unhurried. None of that should have mattered. But in Livia's mind, a quiet alarm began to ring. She'd never admitted outright, but over the years she'd grown used to captains looking a certain way. Older, often white, always speaking with a tone that demanded instant respect. This man? He didn't match the image in her head. When Darian reached the cockpit door, he turned slightly and showed his credentials to the lead purser, as protocol required. Livia watched from a few feet away, arms crossed. Something about the way he handed over his badge, calm, almost too calm, made her suspicious. She'd heard stories after all. Imposters sneaking into cockpits. People posing as crew to avoid tickets. It was rare, sure, but not impossible. And in her mind, better safe than sorry. "Who's that?" she asked the purser once Darian had stepped inside. "Captain Okoro." The purser replied without looking up. "He's flying today." Livia frowned. "He's the captain, really?" The purser finally glanced at her. "Yes, Livia, really." But Livia didn't let it go. During the pre-flight briefing in the galley, when Darian emerged to introduce himself to the cabin crew, she studied him like he was a puzzle she needed to solve. He spoke clearly, outlined the flight time, weather in Denver, any special passengers, standard stuff. He even cracked a small joke about the coffee in the crew lounge being braver than most of us. A few attendants chuckled. Livia didn't. When he finished and turned to leave, she stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said, voice polite but edged with something sharper underneath. "Can I see your ID again?" Darian paused. He didn't sigh or roll his eyes. He simply turned, reached for his badge, and held it out. "Of course." She took it, examined it closely. Name, photo, employee number, FAA license number. Everything checked out. But still that nagging doubt clung to her. "You're the captain?" she asked again, as if repeating it might reveal a flaw. "Yes," he said evenly. "I am." She handed back the badge slowly. "Just making sure," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Darian nodded once and walked back to the cockpit. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice, but inside a quiet frustration simmered. He'd been here before, not often, but enough. The extra scrutiny, the double checks, the way some people's eyes lingered just a second too long, as if trying to catch him in a lie. He'd learned long ago not to react, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. So he took a breath, strapped into his seat, and began his pre-flight checks with First Officer Elena Ruiz, who'd flown with him dozens of times and trusted him without question. Outside, passengers began boarding. Families with kids, business travelers with rolling suitcases, a group of college students heading west for spring break. The cabin filled with the usual mix of chatter, overhead bin thuds, and the occasional baby's cry. Everything seemed normal, except for the tension humming near the front. Livia couldn't shake it. Every time she passed the cockpit door, she glanced at it like it might burst open with some hidden truth. She told herself she was just doing her job, protecting the flight. But deep down, a small, uncomfortable voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, her suspicion had less to do with safety and more to do with something she didn't want to name. During final boarding, as the last passengers shuffled down the aisle, Livia approached the cockpit again. This time she didn't ask politely. She stood just outside the open door and said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I still don't believe you're the real captain." Elena, who was reviewing the flight plan, looked up in shock. Darian turned slowly in his seat. His expression hadn't changed, still calm, still professional, but his eyes held a new weight. "I've shown you my credentials twice," he said, voice low but firm. "I'm the captain of this aircraft. If you have a concern, file a report after the flight. But right now we have a schedule to keep." Livia crossed her arms. "People pretend to be crew all the time. I've seen it, and you don't look like a captain." The words hung in the air like smoke. A woman in 5C stopped unpacking her bag. A man in 7A glanced over his shoulder. Elena's jaw tightened. Darian didn't flinch. "What does a captain look like to you, Livia?" She didn't answer. She couldn't, because the truth was ugly, and she wasn't ready to face it, not here, not now. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked back to the galley, muttering about protocols and safety risks. But the damage was done. The cabin crew exchanged uneasy glances. Passengers whispered. And Darian sat in his seat staring at the instrument panel, wondering how many more times he'd have to prove he belonged, on a job he'd earned, on a plane he was qualified to fly, in a sky that asked for skill, not skin color. The cabin doors closed. The pushback tug connected. The engines rumbled to life. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the usual pre-takeoff checklist unfolded. Flaps set, systems green, tower clearance received. But beneath the routine, something had shifted. The flight hadn't even left the ground, and already it carried a heavier load than fuel and luggage. Darian gripped the yoke as the tower gave them the go-ahead. "Skyward 217, runway 27L, cleared for takeoff." "Cleared for takeoff, 27L, Skyward 217, he replied, voice steady. The engines roared. The plane accelerated, and as the wheels lifted off the tarmac, Atlanta shrinking below, Darian didn't look back. He focused on the horizon, on the clouds ahead, on the job he loved. But in the galley behind him, Livia stood stiffly, arms crossed, still convinced she'd done the right thing. She had no idea that her words, spoken in doubt, fueled by bias, had already set something in motion, something that wouldn't end when the plane landed in Denver, something that would ripple far beyond this flight, this day, this moment of quiet confrontation in the narrow aisle of an ordinary airplane. For now, though, the only sound was the hum of the engines and the soft murmur of passengers settling in. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, indifferent to human judgments, and Darian Okoro, captain of Flight 217, flew on, carrying not just passengers but the quiet weight of a truth too many refused to see. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign clicked off with a soft chime. Outside, the sky was a flawless blue stretching endlessly in every direction. Inside, the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of a mid-morning flight. Passengers opening snacks, adjusting earbuds, flipping through magazines. But near the front, the air still felt tight, like a storm had passed but left its charge behind. Livia Marsh moved through the aisle with her usual efficiency, offering drinks and checking on passengers. Yet her mind kept circling back to the cockpit. She told herself she was just being cautious. After all, safety was everyone's responsibility, wasn't it? But the more she replayed the captain's face, the calm eyes, the steady voice, the more uneasy she felt. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he hadn't reacted the way she expected. Most people accused of impersonating an airline employee would get angry, defensive, flustered. He hadn't, and that unnerved her more than shouting ever could. About 40 minutes into the flight, as the crew began serving lunch trays, Livia made her decision. She waited until the other attendants were busy in the rear galley, then walked purposefully toward the cockpit. She knocked once, sharper than necessary, and when the door opened, she didn't wait for an invitation. "I need to verify your identity again," she said, voice low but firm, standing just inside the doorway so passengers couldn't see her, but close enough that her words carried. First Officer Elena Ruiz looked up from her checklist, eyebrows raised. "Again? Livia, we went over this before boarding." "I don't care," Livia said, crossing her arms. "I have a responsibility to this aircraft and everyone on it. If someone's pretending to be crew, that's a security risk." Darian turned in his seat slowly. He didn't sigh. He didn't raise his voice. But his expression had changed, less patience, more resolve. "You've seen my FAA license. You've seen my company ID. You've heard my call sign with air traffic control. What more do you need?" "I need to be sure," she insisted. "Because honestly, you don't look like someone who should be flying this plane." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. Even Elena, usually unflappable, stiffened. Darian didn't move for a long moment. Then he reached into his flight bag and pulled out his FAA airline transport pilot certificate. Thick paper, official seal, his name and photo clear as day. He held it out without a word. Livia took it, scanned it quickly, then handed it back. "That could be fake," she muttered. Elena finally spoke up. "Livia, I've flown with Captain Okoro for 3 years. He trained half the captains in this airline. He's not an imposter. He's one of the most respected pilots we have." But Livia shook her head. "I've seen people like you try this before," she said, her voice dropping, but not enough. "Dress up, memorize a few phrases, bluff your way into the cockpit. It's happened." Darian stood up slowly. He wasn't tall in an intimidating way, but there was a presence to him, a quiet strength that filled the small space. He removed his cap, ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, and looked her straight in the eye. "You've crossed a line," he said, voice calm but edged with something deeper, hurt maybe, or disappointment. "This isn't about safety. This is about what you think a captain should look like, and that's not your call to make." A passenger in 3A, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, had been watching the exchange from her seat. She leaned slightly forward, frowning. Another passenger, a young man with a camera bag, subtly turned his phone toward the front, just enough to catch audio, not video. He didn't want to escalate things, but he also didn't want this moment to vanish. Livia's cheeks flushed. "I'm just doing my job," she snapped. But her voice wavered. "No," Darian said gently. "You're letting your assumptions do your job for you." He stepped past her and walked toward the rear galley, leaving the cockpit door open behind him. The cabin crew froze as he approached. Some looked away. Others met his gaze with quiet sympathy. He didn't say anything to them. He just stood by the service counter, took a slow breath, and stared out the nearest window at the endless blue. Back at the front, Livia stood rooted in place, heart pounding. She told herself she was right, that she'd been vigilant. But the silence from the other attendants spoke louder than words. No one backed her up. No one even looked at her. And when she finally returned to the galley, she caught the older woman in 3A watching her with a look that wasn't anger, just sadness. Minutes passed. The lunch service continued, but the mood had shifted. Conversations were quieter. Laughter was absent. Even the usual clinking of trays felt muted. Darian eventually returned to the cockpit, closing the door behind him without a word. But the tension didn't leave with him. It stayed, coiled in the air like static before a storm. Then, about an hour later, as the plane cruised smoothly over Kansas, Darian emerged again. This time, he didn't head for the galley or speak to anyone. He walked to the very back of the plane near the lavatories, pulled out his personal phone, and stepped into a small alcove where crew sometimes took quick breaks. He dialed a number from memory. The call lasted less than a minute. "Miriam," he said quietly. "It's Darian Okoro. I'm on Flight 217 en route to Denver. I've just been accused of impersonating a pilot by one of your flight attendants, Livia Marsh. She's questioned my credentials 3 times, told me I don't look like a captain, and implied I'm a security threat. I need you to call the aircraft immediately." He gave the internal line number, then added, "And Miriam, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Not with her and not with others." He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and walked calmly toward the cockpit. But before he reached it, the aircraft's intercom beeped, a soft internal tone only the crew would recognize. The lead purser, a soft-spoken man named Theo, answered the call in the front galley. His face changed as he listened. His eyes flicked to Livia, then to the cockpit, then back to the handset. He nodded several times, said, "Yes, ma'am," twice and hung up. Then he turned to Livia. "You need to take this call," he said, holding out the phone. His voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't kind either. It was final. Livia took the handset, confused. "Hello?" What followed was a conversation so brief and sharp that those nearby could only catch fragments. "Unacceptable. Violation of policy. Ground security will meet you. Do not return to the cockpit." When she handed the phone back, her hands were shaking. Her face had gone pale. She looked around as if expecting someone to tell her it was a joke, but no one did. Theo simply said, "Gather your things. You're being removed from duty." Panic flickered in her eyes. "What? Why?" You'll be briefed on the ground," Theo cut in gently but firmly. "For now, please step to the rear jump seat and stay there until we land." She opened her mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't up for debate. Something had changed, something she hadn't seen coming. The call Darian made hadn't been to complain. It had been to activate a protocol she didn't even know existed. As she walked back, head down, passengers watched her go. The older woman in 3A gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The young man with the camera bag tucked his phone away, his expression thoughtful. In the cockpit, Darian settled back into his seat. Elena glanced at him. "You okay?" He nodded. "Just tired of proving I belong." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. They both knew this wasn't really about one flight attendant. It was about every time someone had doubted him because of how he looked. Every time he'd been asked to show his papers, while his white colleagues walked through unchallenged. Every time he'd swallowed his pride to keep the peace. Now, for once, the system had responded, not with silence but with action. As the plane began its descent into Denver, the cabin grew quiet again. But this time the silence felt different, lighter somehow, like something heavy had been lifted. Livia sat in the back, staring at her hands, replaying every word she'd said, wondering when caution had turned into cruelty. And up front, Darian guided the aircraft down through the clouds, steady as ever. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just flew because that's what he'd always done. Not for approval, not for recognition, but because the sky didn't care what you looked like. It only asked if you knew how to listen, how to respond, how to carry others safely through the storm. And he did. Every single time. The wheels touched down in Denver with a gentle thud, and the reverse thrusters kicked in with a familiar roar. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac. Inside, the cabin remained quiet, quieter than usual for a landing. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts slowly, some glancing toward the back where Livia sat, rigid and pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't look up. She didn't make eye contact. She just stared at the floor as if it might swallow her whole. As the plane taxied to the gate, the lead purser, Theo, moved with calm efficiency. He'd already radioed ahead to ground operations. He'd confirmed that Skyward Airways security was waiting. He'd also discreetly informed the other flight attendants not to engage with Livia. No comfort, no confrontation, just space. It wasn't personal. It was protocol. And right now, protocol was all that stood between a messy scene and a controlled resolution. When the aircraft came to a stop and the seatbelt sign clicked off, Darian remained in the cockpit for a few extra minutes. He wasn't avoiding anything. He just needed a moment. His hands rested lightly on the yoke, eyes fixed on the ground crew waving orange wands outside. He thought about the call he'd made, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. How many times could a person prove they belonged before the burden became too heavy? He hadn't wanted her fired. He'd wanted her to see. But sometimes seeing only comes after consequences. Elena stood beside him, sipping from a water bottle. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "I didn't do it for me," he replied. "I did it for the next guy who looks like me and gets asked to prove he's real." She nodded. No more words were needed. Meanwhile, at the gate, a man in a dark Skyward security uniform stood just outside the jet bridge, clipboard in hand. He wasn't there to arrest anyone, this wasn't a criminal matter, but to escort Livia off the aircraft and into a private debriefing room. Company policy was clear. Any accusation of discrimination or harassment by crew, especially when witnessed by passengers, triggered an immediate investigation. And in this case, there were witnesses, several of them. As passengers began to disembark, many slowed as they passed Livia. Some gave her pitying looks. Others avoided her entirely. The older woman from 3A paused briefly, then said softly, "Maybe next time, trust what you see, not what you assume." She didn't wait for a reply. She just walked on. Livia flinched as if struck. She wanted to argue, to explain that she'd only been trying to protect everyone, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down she knew this wasn't about protection. It was about perception, and her perception had been clouded by something she'd never fully admitted even to herself. Once the cabin was empty except for crew, Theo approached her. "It's time," he said gently. She stood slowly, her uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too heavy. She gathered her small bag, checked her name tag, still clipped neatly to her blouse, and followed him down the jet bridge. The security officer greeted her with a neutral expression. "Ms. Marsh, please come with me." She didn't speak as they walked through the terminal, past bustling travelers and glowing departure boards. She kept her eyes forward, but her mind raced. Would she lose her job? Would this go public? What would her coworkers think? What would her family say? Back on the plane, Darian finally stepped out of the cockpit. The cabin crew had already begun their post-flight checks, stowing carts, collecting trash, resetting seats. None of them looked at him with awe or anger. They just nodded respectfully as he passed. One younger attendant, barely 2 years on the job, gave him a small, grateful smile. He returned it with a quiet nod. He didn't linger. He collected his bag, said a brief goodbye to Elena, and walked toward the crew exit. As he passed through the terminal, he noticed a few passengers from his flight still hanging around near baggage claim. Some were talking animatedly. Others were on their phones. He didn't stop. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to get to his hotel, shower, and forget the day if he could. But forgetting wasn't so easy. By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread, not through official channels, but through the quiet network of airline employees. A flight attendant in Chicago heard it from a Denver-based colleague. A pilot in Dallas got a text from a friend who'd been on the flight. By lunchtime, it was the talk of the crew lounge at Skyward's Atlanta hub. What surprised people wasn't that it had happened. It was that someone had finally said something. Over the next few days, internal emails started circulating. Human Resources launched a formal investigation. They interviewed passengers who'd been willing to share their accounts. They reviewed the cockpit voice recorder, not for pilot error but for context. They pulled Livia's personnel file and found something unsettling. 3 prior complaints over the past 5 years, all involving similar behavior, questioning the credentials of non-white crew members, often without cause. Each time it had been dismissed as overzealousness or miscommunication. No formal action had been taken, but this time was different. This time, the captain had been a senior pilot with an unblemished record. This time there were recordings, audio clips shared privately among passengers, not posted online, but enough to confirm the tone and content of the exchange. And this time leadership couldn't look away. Miriam Cho, Skyward's director of flight operations, the woman Darian had called mid-flight, was known for her no-nonsense approach. She'd been a pilot herself before moving into management, and she hated when bias disguised itself as vigilance. When the investigation report landed on her desk, she didn't hesitate. She scheduled an emergency meeting with HR, legal, and the head of cabin services. "We've tolerated this too long," she said, tapping the file. "This isn't about one flight attendant. It's about a pattern, and if we don't act now, we're telling every crew member of color that their credentials mean less than their skin." The decision was made quickly. Livia would be placed on unpaid administrative leave pending final review. But everyone knew what that meant. In airline culture, that kind of leave rarely ended with a return to duty. Meanwhile, Darian kept flying. He took a red-eye to Seattle, then a morning hop to Phoenix. He didn't mention the incident to his new crews. He didn't post about it online. He just did his job. But word followed him anyway. At gates and crew lounges, other pilots, especially younger black and brown pilots, sought him out. Not for autographs or praise, but for quiet conversations. One evening in a hotel bar in Salt Lake City, a first officer named Keon sat down beside him. "I heard what happened in Denver," Keon said, stirring his soda. "I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for you, but for all of us who've been doubted before we even spoke." Darian looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Just keep flying," he said. "That's how we change it." Back in Atlanta, Livia sat in her apartment, blinds drawn. She'd received the official letter, termination pending final review, effective immediately. Her access badge had been deactivated. Her company email shut down. Friends from work had stopped texting. She replayed the flight over and over in her head, searching for the moment it went wrong. Was it when she first doubted him? When she said he didn't look like a captain? Or when she refused to believe him, even after proof? She wanted to believe she'd been misled by instinct. But instinct, she was starting to realize, was often just prejudice dressed in a uniform. What she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that Darian wasn't done. He'd spoken to Miriam again, not to demand punishment, but to propose something better. A mentorship program pairing junior pilots from underrepresented backgrounds with senior captains. A way to build trust from the inside out. Miriam had listened. And for the first time in years, she saw a path forward that wasn't just about discipline, but about change. As the sun set over Denver on the day of the incident, no one cheered. No one posted viral videos, but something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Because sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the ones that explode. They're the ones that settle quietly into the bones of an institution and begin to reshape it from within. And Darian Okoro, still flying, still steady, was already thinking about the next flight. Not as a symbol, not as a victim, but as a man who believed the sky belonged to everyone who knew how to navigate it, with skill, with grace, and with the courage to speak up when someone tried to say otherwise. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday. Thick paper, company logo at the top, words that felt colder than they should have been. Livia Marsh read it 3 times, each time hoping the meaning would change. It didn't. Her employment with Skyward Airways was terminated, effective immediately, due to repeated violations of the company's code of conduct and discriminatory behavior, inconsistent with our values. There was no room for appeal, no promise of rehire, just a clean, quiet end to 8 years of service. She sat at her kitchen table long after the sun went down, the letter still in her hands. Outside, Atlanta hummed with its usual nighttime rhythm. Cars on the highway, distant laughter from a neighbor's porch, the occasional dog barking. Inside, it was silent. No calls came, no texts. Even her closest friend from the airline, someone she'd shared layovers and secrets with for years, hadn't reached out. Not to gloat, not to comfort, just nothing. And that silence hurt more than the letter itself. She thought about the flight over and over. Not just the confrontation, but everything leading up to it. Had she really believed Darian was an imposter? Or had she just felt uneasy because he didn't fit the picture in her head? The one she'd built from years of seeing mostly white men in captain seats. She remembered the way he'd looked at her. Not with anger, but with disappointment, like she'd failed a test she didn't even know she was taking. And maybe she had. Meanwhile, across town, Darian Okoro was packing for another trip. Not because he wanted to escape, but because flying was still his refuge. The sky didn't hold grudges. It didn't question your right to be there. It just asked you to pay attention, to respect its rules, and to carry your passengers home safely. That part hadn't changed, but things on the ground had. News of what happened in Denver hadn't gone viral. Darian made sure of that. He declined every interview request. He didn't post about it on social media. He didn't want this to become a spectacle. But word traveled fast in the aviation world. Pilots, flight attendants, even gate agents began talking, not just about Livia, but about the quiet moments they'd all experienced. The extra ID checks, the skeptical glances, the offhand comments disguised as jokes. For the first time, people felt safe naming what they'd long ignored. Skyward Airways responded faster than anyone expected. Within a week, the airline announced a full review of its cabin crew training program. Unconscious bias modules, once optional, were now mandatory for all employees. Supervisors would undergo retraining on how to handle discrimination complaints, and for the first time, The company created a confidential reporting system specifically for crew members who felt targeted because of their race, gender, or background. But the real surprise came in an internal memo sent to all flight operations staff. Darian Okoro had been appointed to lead a new initiative, the Horizon Mentorship Program. Its goal was simple: to pair junior pilots from underrepresented communities with experienced captains for one-on-one guidance, not just on flying, but on navigating the unspoken challenges of the industry. The program would start small with 10 mentees in its first cohort, but the hope was that it would grow. When Darian told his sister about it over the phone, she laughed softly. "So you turned a mess into a mission?" "I didn't want a mess," he said. "I just wanted to be treated like I belonged." "Well," she replied, "maybe now others will too." Back at Skyward headquarters, Miriam Cho sat in her office reviewing the final investigation report. She'd read every passenger statement, listened to the audio clips, studied Livia's personnel file. What troubled her most wasn't just Livia's actions. It was how easily they'd been overlooked before. 3 prior complaints all brushed aside. "Overzealous," one supervisor had written. "Passionate about safety," said another. But passion shouldn't come at the cost of dignity. She called a meeting with the CEO. "We can't just fire our way out of this," she said. "We have to rebuild trust from the inside out." The CEO agreed. And so, alongside the new training and reporting systems, Skyward announced it would partner with historically black colleges and aviation programs to recruit more diverse talent. They'd also fund scholarships for students from communities underrepresented in commercial aviation. It wasn't a fix-all, but it was a start. For Livia, the fallout wasn't just professional, it was personal. Her mother called, confused and hurt. "You always said you loved your job. What happened?" Livia couldn't explain without sounding defensive, so she stayed quiet. Her younger brother, who'd looked up to her as the successful one, stopped mentioning her job in family group chats. She felt like a ghost in her own life. One afternoon, she drove to the airport, not to work, but just to sit in the parking lot and watch planes take off. She remembered how proud she'd been on her first day, how she'd ironed her uniform the night before, how she'd dreamed of seeing the world from 35,000 feet. Somewhere along the way, that pride had twisted into something else, something rigid, something suspicious. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone, but intent didn't erase impact. She thought about Darian, not as a threat but as a person, a man who'd trained others, flown through storms, carried thousands of lives in his hands, and still had to prove he was real. The weight of that realization settled on her chest like a stone. She considered writing him a letter. Not to excuse what she'd done, but to apologize. In the end, she didn't. She wasn't sure he'd want to hear from her, and maybe some apologies were better lived than spoken. Meanwhile, Darian met with the first group of Horizon mentees in a quiet conference room at the airline's training center. They were young, early 20s mostly. Some were nervous, others were angry, having faced their own versions of what he'd endured. He didn't give them a speech. He just told them his story, the real one, not the polished version. "I didn't get here because I was special," he said. "I got here because I refused to let doubt, mine or anyone else's, ground me. And you won't either." One young woman, a first-generation college student from New Orleans, raised her hand. "What do you do when someone questions you?" "And you know it's because of how you look?" Darian leaned forward. "You stay calm. You show your credentials. You do your job better than anyone expects. And then, you make sure the next person doesn't have to fight the same battle." It wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. As the weeks passed, small changes rippled through Skyward. Flight attendants started double-checking their own assumptions. Pilots began speaking up when they heard offhand remarks in the crew lounge. Even passengers noticed a shift. The cabin felt more respectful, more united. And Livia? She enrolled in a community college course on cultural awareness, not because she had to, but because she finally wanted to understand. She didn't know if she'd ever fly again. Commercial airlines rarely rehire after a termination like hers. But maybe she could do something else. Maybe she could help others avoid the same blind spots. The story of Flight 217 didn't end with a firing. It ended with a reckoning and a quiet kind of hope. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the steady kind that grows when people choose to learn instead of defend, to listen instead of assume, to build instead of break. And high above the clouds, Darian Okoro kept flying, not as a symbol but as a reminder that belonging isn't earned through permission. It's claimed through presence, persistence, and the courage to stay in the cockpit, even when someone tries to tell you you don't belong there. Months passed, and the sharp edges of what happened on Flight 217 began to soften, not because people forgot, but because they chose to grow from it. Livia Marsh didn't vanish. She didn't disappear into shame or silence. Instead, she showed up, quietly, humbly, at a local community center that offered workshops on bias and inclusion. She sat in the back at first, listening more than speaking. She took notes. She asked questions, not to argue, but to understand. It wasn't redemption she was after, it was clarity. And slowly, painfully, she started to see the world through eyes that weren't clouded by assumption. She never returned to aviation. That door had closed and she accepted it. But she found a new path, helping train customer service teams at a regional transit authority. This time with a focus on equity and respect. She didn't mention her past unless asked. But when she did, she spoke plainly. I thought I was being careful, but I was actually being cruel, and I won't make that mistake again. Meanwhile, Darian Okoro kept flying, but his role had quietly expanded. The Horizon mentorship program he'd helped launch was now in its second cohort, with 20 mentees from diverse backgrounds: Black, Latino, South Asian, Indigenous, women, first-generation Americans. He didn't run it alone. He'd brought in other senior pilots, flight engineers, even veteran flight attendants who understood what it meant to be doubted before being seen. One crisp autumn morning, Darian stood at the edge of a small airfield outside Atlanta, watching a group of mentees go through their first solo simulator session. Among them was a young woman named Taylor, who'd grown up in a neighborhood where no one she knew had ever flown a plane. Her hands trembled the first time she touched the yoke, not from fear of crashing, but from fear of not belonging. Now she moved with growing confidence, her voice steady as she called out checklists. After the session, she walked over to Darian, still in her flight suit, eyes bright. I saw a kid today at the airport, she said. He pointed at me and asked his mom, can girls be pilots? And she said, yes, and that one right there is going to be a captain someday. Darian smiled. You already are, he said. You just haven't gotten the stripes yet. That moment, small, ordinary, human, meant more to him than any headline ever could. Back at Skyward Airways, the changes weren't just policy, they were cultural. New hires now went through immersive training that included real stories from crew members who'd faced bias. Supervisors were evaluated not just on performance metrics, but on how they fostered inclusion. And the confidential reporting system? It had already led to 3 interventions. Small course corrections before situations escalated. Passengers noticed too. On a flight from Chicago to San Diego, a man in his 60s pulled a flight attendant aside after landing. I flew for 30 years in the Air Force, he said. And I just wanted to say, your crew felt like a team. Not just co-workers. A real team. The attendant thanked him, but inside, she knew it was because they'd finally learned to see each other fully. The story of Flight 217 never became a viral scandal. There were no courtroom dramas, no fiery resignations, no public shaming. Instead, it became a quiet turning point. A moment when an airline, a pilot, and even a flight attendant chose to let a painful incident become a doorway rather than a dead end. Darian never sought praise. In fact, he avoided it. When a local news station finally tracked him down for a human interest piece, he declined to appear on camera. This isn't about me, he told the reporter over the phone. It's about making sure the next person doesn't have to prove they belong just to do their job. But people remembered. Not the confrontation itself, but what came after. The way Darian handled it, with dignity, not drama, became a quiet legend among new pilots. At aviation schools, instructors began using the incident, without names, as a case study in professionalism under pressure. What would you do? They'd ask, and more students answered, I'd stay calm, I'd speak up, and I'd trust the system to do the right thing. That trust, fragile as it was, had been earned, not given. One evening, Darian received an unexpected email. It was from the older woman who'd been in seat 3A on Flight 217. She wrote that she'd followed the news about the mentorship program and wanted to donate to support it. You didn't just fly that day, she wrote. You carried something heavier than passengers, And you landed it with grace. He read it twice, then forwarded it to Miriam with a simple note. This is why we keep going. As the year turned, Skyward Airways released its first diversity and inclusion report. It wasn't perfect, progress never is, but it showed measurable improvement. More diverse hires, fewer bias complaints, higher retention among minority crew members. The Horizon program was highlighted as a key driver, and at the bottom of the report in small print was a line that made Darian pause. Inspired by lived experience and a commitment to change. He didn't need his name attached. The work spoke for itself. Livia, for her part, began volunteering with a youth aviation club in her city. She didn't wear a uniform anymore, but